Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for your testimony, and I'm looking at an article that is printed 25th June 2014, El Periodico, which is a Guatemalan newspaper. It's an AP story in Spanish. It says, essentially in Spanish and English, that 2/3 of the children that are unaccompanied minors coming to the United States are coming from either Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras. I think we're consistent with that in our testimony that I hear, or at least relatively close, that only 12% come from Mexico, although the rest of them come through Mexico, kind of like our drugs, from or through Mexico. That 80% are male, and 83% are over 14 but unaccompanied minors. That means 15, 16, or 17 years old. I'd say first, Mr. Vitaleo, does that consistent with what you have observed on the border?
That is consistent.
And Mr. Crane?
I don't have that type of data, sir.
I didn't actually guess that's the case, and also be a case for Mr. Judd?
From what I've been told from the agents, yes, that is correct.
Thank you. And I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce this article into the record.
Without objection, the article will be made a part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I looked at some other data here, and as I roll down through this and listen to the testimony about the fear of violence, and that being at least proposed as the primary reason that these young people are leaving their countries. And so I began to check this out, and I see that 8 of the top 10 most violent countries in the world are Central America or Northern South America. And among these countries, and I'll read down through the list from 1 to 10, Honduras, the most violent, has been testified here, 90.4 murders per 100,000. Venezuela is second, 53.7. Belize third, 44.7. El Salvador next with 41.2 murders, homicides per 100,000. Then Guatemala, then Jamaica, Swaziland in Africa, then St. Kitts, then South Africa, then Colombia 10th. These are very shocking numbers, and that would tell us all that the most violent countries in the world, 8 of 10 of them, are to our southern border. United States homicide rate 6.5 per 100,000. Mexico's 18.2, roughly triple that of the United States. Both those numbers have gone up over the last 5 years, and yet going south it gets far more dangerous. But I wonder, what can I compare that to? Well, Venezuela, 53.7, number 2 most violent country in the world, has to look up to Detroit. Violent death rate in Detroit, homicide rate in Detroit, 54.6, compared to Venezuela's 53.7. The rest of the countries that I read range all the way down from 53.7 down to Colombia at 30.8. So if we're going to move kids into America with the idea that we're going to get them away from violence, we at least have to keep them out of Detroit. And I don't see people that are exiting Detroit because the city is that dangerous. Some probably do. But we should put this in perspective. And I'd also make the point that these children that are coming here, these thousands of unaccompanied minors that are coming here, there was a child in one of my towns that was found wandering on the street in a neighborhood, several blocks away from her mother, who was sleeping during the day because she was working at night, to her credit. But she nodded off, and the child got out and walked away. Our Department of Human Services picked this child up, referred by a resident, identified the mother, and said to her, if this happens again, you're in danger of having your child taken away from you, because we don't tolerate child endangerment or child abandonment in the United States of America. We don't tolerate it in Iowa. We don't tolerate it in America. Yet, we're watching tens of thousands of kids that are being abandoned into the United States, pushed across 1,000 miles of Mexico in some of the most dangerous terrain and the dangerous drug and cartel violence that there is. And somehow, we as a country are reuniting these families by bringing these children under force of law, violating the law and completing the crime, and putting these children into households where there's an illegal mom or an illegal dad or both. No country in its right mind would repatriate families who have abandoned their children and pushed them across 1,000 miles of Mexico and handed them over to the Border Patrol and said, hand them over to ICE, and now HHS is going to deliver them into these households and not enforce the law. This is so appalling to me. But I would ask, Mr. Judd, with this concept that I have laid out here, how do we respond to this if we're going to be a nation of laws and have a rule of law?
Well, what we'd have to do is we would have to take the parents into custody when they take custody of the children. But we're not given that opportunity because we give them over to HHS, and then HHS gives them over to this new escort service, who then flies them. In fact, my coworker that's here with me today sat next to an El Salvadoran 8-year-old on a plane with somebody from this new service. And when they got off the plane here in Washington, D.C.,